9 p.m. on the India development debate, government justifies the stringent clauses in the IBC Ordinance that virtually shuts the door on promoters from insolvency bidding. Top officials tell ET Now that a group of deeply entrenched promoters have launched a misinformation campaign with vested interests. Also rejects valuation concerns raised by banks even as they slam promoters for mismanagement of companies. That's a mega ET Now exclusive.
GST collections take a hit in October after the government revised tax rates. Total revenue comes in at 83,346 crore rupees as against a little over 92,000 crore rupees last month. A total of 95.9 lakh taxpayers registered under the GST so far, but not many of them are paying taxes.
The Prime Minister launches a no-holds-barred attack on the Congress as he kickstarts the election campaign in Gujarat, coming down strongly on opposition's chai wala jibe. Modi says, yes, he did sell tea in the past, but certainly did not sell the nation. Also accuses the Grand Old Party of insulting Sardar Patel and Morarji Desai.
Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal runs into trouble with the tax officials yet again. The Income Tax Department raises a 30 crore rupee demand on the Aam Aadmi Party for violating norms while collecting donations. Kejriwal hits back, calls the move a part of the Modi government's strategy to prosecute his party.
Elected autocrats can take nations down the wrong path, warns former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan, participating in a discussion at the Times Lit-Fest in Delhi. Rajan says governments need to listen to a broader spectrum of people to reduce the possibility of mistakes.
A complete overhaul of the gold import policy is in the works. ET Now learns the Commerce Ministry is in favour of reducing the import duty on gold to 5 to 6% from the current 10% rate. Also set up a dedicated regulator to streamline industry policy.
Debt woes continue for Anil Ambani-led Reliance Communications as yet another investor files an insolvency plea against the telco. China Development Bank moves the NCLT to initiate proceedings under Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. CDB is the company's first overseas creditor to seek action.
It's wedding bells for Prince Harry and suit star Meghan Markle. Harry, the fifth in line to the British throne, will marry his year-long girlfriend Meghan Markle next spring in London.
India development debate this Monday evening. The government has come all guns blazing on the recently unveiled IBC Ordinance, which virtually bars errant promoters winning back their assets through the bidding route. Coming down heavily on the critics of the new law, top government officials tell ET Now that a group of disenchanted promoters have been spreading wrong information only to protect their vested interests. They clarified that there is no iron curtain on promoters and they can join the bidding process once they clear the outstanding dues with banks, cracking the whip on promoters who are crying foul for denying them a second chance. Sources tell us that in some cases the net debt to EBITDA ratio is over 60 in several cases, which means it could take at least 60 years for companies to clear their NPA burden if the assets are handed over to the same promoter.
Indeed. Now, not just that, squarely blaming the promoter for the pile-up of the bad debt, the government says in several cases it is sheer mismanagement that has led to the situation, and it is ridiculous to blame the economy for the poor state of affairs. On the argument that it is an international practice to allow promoters to buy back their assets through insolvency bidding, the officials explain that the business scene in India, where too much of power is concentrated in the hands of the promoter class, is totally different. Now remember, the government's all-out attack comes against the backdrop of reservations expressed by some bank heads and even CEOs who believe the new norms are against the spirit of the insolvency proceedings and could affect valuations as well. The continuing slug-fest over the IBC Ordinance, that's a big and a very hot topic of debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. I'm Supriya Srinath in New Delhi, and joining me in Mumbai is my colleague Sandeep Gurumurthy. Taking us through over the next 1 hour is a very, very special panel. Mr. M.S. Sahu, Chairperson of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India; Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance; Cyril Shroff, Managing Partner Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas; Sumant Batra, Managing Partner Kesar Das P and Associates; and Maitli Busnurmat, our consulting editor right here at ET Now. Thanks very, very much all of you for being with us this evening. This topic refuses to die out of headlines, and which is why we're really putting the focus back to the IBC and the slugfest of sorts that it's created. Mr. Sahu, let me begin with you. It does look like a battle of words. It does look like there's a slugfest between category of promoters on one hand and the government on the other. Was this meant to be a signal to promoters and to corporate India that credit discipline must be respected and that errant promoters have no divine right to stay in control?
Yeah, two clarifications. One, we are not talking about promoter versus non-promoter, nor we are talking about public money versus private money. The Insolvency Bankruptcy Code deals resolution of insolvency of a corporate debtor which has defaulted in dues. The dues could be to a public bank, a private bank, NBFC, debenture holder, fixed deposit holder, or any kind of a lender could be there. So first is it's not public money, private money. Second is the requirement that the code says talks about the eligibility for resolution applicants. It does not say the promoters are eligible or not eligible. The same standard would apply to a promoter as to a non-promoter. It only says that Mr. X is eligible only if it does not have a criminal background, it is not a willful defaulter, it is not disqualified from becoming a director of a company. So the requirement equally applies to a promoter as well as a non-promoter. The message is that, the question was, the message is that all of us are interested through this process to have maximization of the value of assets of the corporate debtor. That is possible only if the corporate is handed over to the most deserving person who has real capability and capacity to turn it around and has a clean antecedents, absolutely no black mark, whom the society can trust.
Fair enough. Cyril Shroff, before we get down to the specifics of what many are calling the unintended consequences of the ordinance, I want your sort of big picture view on what's happened. You know, do you believe that this ordinance and these tweaking of these norms have been done under pressure of public opinion? Because it would have been very difficult for this government, or for that matter any government, to justify business tycoons bankrupting their own firms and then buying them as sort of at a discount, buying them back at a discount. So that moral dilemma is what has guided this entire ordinance. Is that your view?
Yes, it is clear, and I think the preamble to the ordinance also makes that clear, that it is because of the potential of a resolution plan being submitted by people whose antecedents may adversely impact the credibility of the process. That's what the ordinance says, which basically is in sort of without the jargon. I think it essentially means that just from a political perspective and from a public opinion perspective, they wanted to avoid the moral hazard and the messaging surrounding people who up till now were in control or in management and would effectively net could land up with being back in control of the assets, albeit at a haircut which would be taken by the banks. And there are of course other things as well, which is such as people with who are disqualified or who have who are otherwise undischarged insolvents, or who have sort of been punished with punishable with an offence. So things like that. But the most crucial part of this is really the defaulting promoters coming back and potentially acquiring the asset at a discount. So they've been kind of deducted at source.
All right, so they've been deducted at source is the legal eagle talking. But Sanjeev Sanyal, have you loaded the dice against promoters as a class? And is that why you're perhaps facing such sharp criticism on the new provisions in the law?
Well, let me make it adequately clear that this government believes in an entrepreneurial economy. So we are certainly not against the entrepreneurial class at all. We are dealing here with businesses that for a variety of reasons have ended up defaulting and have been in that state for a significant period of time, where they have been a period of 6 months over which even after been put into the NCLT process. Various efforts have been made to resolve the matter, and consequently something has to be done to ultimately liquefy these assets and get them on stream again. So this is not about targeting a specific entrepreneur or the promoters as a class. After all, we are hoping that some other promoter will take up this asset and make it work.
Okay, let me take it to Mr. Batra then, who joins in as well, who's got some understanding of the insolvency code as being a part of that as well. Mr. Batra, do you believe that this is essentially being done to send a signal to the, a sweeping signal to the entire promoter class, and that the unintended consequences has been that that it's also sent a signal to sort of a well-meaning promoter, if I may use that word?
Sandeep, I couldn't really gather, there was some disruption in the audio, so I couldn't really gather your question, but allow me to answer from whatever I could gather. But before I do that, let me just first of all say that no one can possibly have any kind of quarrel with the objective that is sought to be achieved through the ordinance. We all understand that those people who are colored, be they are promoters or otherwise, should be kept away from acquiring the companies back again, and that too at heavy discounts. And largely, therefore, I don't really have any problem with the objectives sought to be achieved. My only concern is that in some way the government might have gone a little overboard in providing some of the clauses in the agreement, and perhaps they could have been done with a little bit more clarity that they had. I possibly have two issues with the section that actually provides the ineligibility provisions. One is with regard to the guarantors. I mean, it appears that the entire class of guarantors have been made ineligible, and I'm sure that was not really the intent of the government, because you really wanted to ring fence the bona fide guarantors, and those have not defaulted. But that is not really coming out from the language of the clause. And there would be probably a good case to revisit that clause when the ordinance is tabled in the Parliament in the form of a bill, because at the moment it leaves a concern. And the second also is to make the definition, the clause with regard to the non-performing asset classification for over 1 year also too broad-based, because as you also mentioned, and as Mr. Sanyal also mentioned, that there could be a variety of reasons because of which a company could go into default. And if it is for bona fide reasons, then one would want to sort of protect them and give them an opportunity and not deprive them just because they've defaulted. Other than these two clauses, I have no really difficulty, because if somebody's been a criminal, somebody has been disqualified as a director, and somebody is a willful defaulter, surely keep them out, and one should. They have to sort of pay the cost for their activities, acts of omission and commission. So I would therefore narrow down on these two things. And there's another point that I wanted to make, which is clause J, which basically says that that the similar corresponding provisions apply to the foreign bidders as may be applicable in their respective countries. Now that also is probably a bit ambiguous in my opinion. And I'm hoping that would get clarified in some way in the regulations that might be brought out by IBBI, or perhaps the language may also be tweaked when the bill is actually tabled in the Parliament later next month.
Maitli, I wanted to come in on that point that everybody is talking about. Do you believe that, I know willful defaulters have been completely barred, and then of course there have been very restrictive clauses that have been put in for the other promoter class, but at one level, do you believe that the dice has been so squarely loaded against them that there is no question of them making a comeback, and which is why you see, quote unquote, the entrenched promoter class making a war cry?
Well, I wouldn't put it in quite such draconian terms, frankly, Supriya, because for the simple reason that I think what the ordinance has done is that in the process of trying to set, puts the promoters willful defaulters. Mind you, there is no concept of willful defaulters anywhere in the world. You're either a defaulter or not a defaulter. So willful itself becomes rather difficult to define. In fact, if you see the RBI circular on a willful defaulter, it becomes a little problematic to say who is really a willful defaulter. What you can certainly define is who is a promoter who is indulged in fraud, there's been some malfeasance. So those cases after a forensic audit one can identify. So willful default is itself problematic, but having us taken for granted at face value it is possible to identify who is a willful defaulter. My problem really with the ordinance is that in a bid to kind of punish the willful defaulters, promoters who have defrauded the bank, the country, etc., we might have shot ourselves in the foot, because we've ruled out an entire class of business interests and corporate interests, because not just willful defaulter, but anybody who's connected with these willful defaulters, any subsidiary company, any guarantor. So I think the section that we have 29, that is 29AC, which says that any account which has been a non-performing account for a year or more, that even those kind of borrowers are ruled out. That to my mind is very draconian, for the simple reason that you could have been a non-performing asset, you could have not paid your dues as a borrower for reasons that are entirely beyond your control. The coal auction got cancelled, there was some disturbance in the country, there were some external factors, the Indonesian hike in the price of coal. So these were all factors that are perhaps not entirely due to the promoters, fraud or things like that. So I think that is what is rather extreme in the Insolvency Code amendment, the ordinance rather. And what you have again another section is 235A, which says that anybody who contravenes any of these very drastic provisions, can be a penalty which is quite large, can be imposed. So in the process, I think what we've done is that we've ruled out almost all of corporate India virtually, because these are large accounts.
Sure.
Some of the accounts of non-performing assets, or the 12 accounts that have been referred to the NCLT, have dues of over 40,000 crores. So
Sure.
those kind of accounts, if you don't have large corporate interest bidding, who are we going to get?
Okay. Fair enough. Let me take it to Sanjeev Sanyal. Sanjeev Sanyal, it's a point that a lot of people are making, that the ordinance fails to make that distinction between willful default and sort of a genuine business failure. It could be for a variety of reasons outside the control of the corporate entity. It could be because licenses were cancelled by a Supreme Court order, or because a policy sort of had an impact on a certain sector. So it could be because of a whole variety of reasons, or like Maitri pointed out, global reasons as well. So has the ordinance failed to make that distinction between a genuine business failure and a sort of willful default?
Well, we are certainly concerned that we don't hurt promoters who are genuine failures. We recognize that the world is full of uncertainties, and business failure does happen for reasons, for many reasons, many of which have nothing to do with fraud or doing something illegal, but purely because of bad luck, the technology changed, or many reasons why this may happen. But remember, it is not the case that on day one, if a promoter or a business has defaulted on a certain asset, that you suddenly get up and begin auctioning and liquidating it. That is far from it. Remember, a long process has already been traversed by the time you end up at this point of having to auction them off. So there has been a process in which defaults have happened, following which there's been a process through the NCLT. We've gone through the whole hog. All along the way, the promoters could, if it was possible for them to have revived it, could have come up with a good plan, and presumably the creditors, after all, they also want to get the best particular price back from their asset. They would have gone along with it. So we are really dealing with something that has just, after many attempts, has simply reached this point that you have to auction it. So even at this stage, nonetheless, the law allows for the original promoter to clear some of these debts and get on with it. But the fact is that we are now, that's why we mentioned very clearly, this is for willful defaulters and those cases where there is clear moral hazard issues.
Okay, so I get your point there, but Cyril Shroff, I'm going to bring this to you, and just to be the devil's advocate, some long-standing default cases with net debt of EBITDA ratio of over 60, which is against the acceptable norm of below 10. It would take about 60 years for the debt to be repaid, assuming current level of liabilities remain intact and perhaps where they are at static. Could this have been just business failure? Because top sources in the government that we are speaking to have attributed this to gross mismanagement. And they say to call it business failure is perhaps being naive.
No, like everything, I think the truth is somewhere in between. So many of these defaults could be because of business failure. Obviously, there have been cases of siphoning and mismanagement. Third could have been because of factors completely outside their control. So there is a variety of reasons, and I think part of the problem that the market is facing with this is that this ordinance does not distinguish between these various nuances. So even if we were to accept, for argument's sake, that it's a bad outcome for bad promoters to get back into control of their assets at a discount, I don't think you can apply that truth to every situation where there could be the defaulters or promoters who may have done well for their company, they mean well, but for factors outside their control have landed up in this position. So the one size fits all approach is probably where the problem is, and I'm not so sure whether there were too many options which the government had, because then they would have had to create a sphere of discretion. That discretion itself would have become a justiciable discretion. So I'm not sure that there are too many solutions to this, but I do believe that there is clearly a problem with the one size fits all approach, and the justice of the outcome of it applying to sort of, if I can call them, good promoters and bad promoters with the same severity is also something which I think we need to reflect on, whether it's a good thing, because the long-term consequences of the message that you send by this to the entrepreneurs in India, to the private sector, is not necessarily a good one. Because what it does is that it says that if you landed up with, for genuine reasons, your asset could be, or your life work could be taken away from you. And when you take that also in an environment where, like, unlike many markets in the world, promoters are required to give personal guarantees. Giving personal guarantees is not a very common financing norm in most markets in the world. It is in India because of the manner in which corporate India is composed. So I think both extremes there is something wrong, and we need to do a little bit more thinking to find out the right answer in between. I accept the fact that bad promoters should not be allowed to come back in control at a discount. Yeah, I don't think there's any quarrel with that.
Okay,
but I think there is a problem with good promoters being deprived as well.
Okay, it's a very strong comment there made by one of India's finest lawyers, Cyril Shroff, saying that the long-term signal that this sends to corporate India is not very good. But we've got a lot of ground to cover. So the other important issue that we need to talk about is price discovery of assets. And Mr. Sahu, and there's been a lot of talk on the fact that the ordinance is going to hurt the price discovery of assets by keeping promoters out. They may well be the ones putting the highest bid on the table. By keeping them out, the price discovery of assets is going to be hurt. How would you respond to that, Mr. Sahu?
First, price discovery, when we talk about genuine price discovery, not spurious price discovery. You are familiar with the security market where SEBI has debarred many non-deserving people to trade or access the security market. Does it mean that SEBI should allow everybody, irrespective of the track record, to trade in a market just because it is likely to affect price discovery? So we are all interested in a genuine price discovery. We are more importantly interested that the corporate goes to a person where it will survive. It is a company, it has to exist in perpetuity. We do not want to give it to a person who will, after again 1 year, 2 years, again the same cycle repeats. So better to take care from now, so that we do not repeat this cycle again.
Mr. Batra, come in on that. What is your own view? Because there's been such a raging debate on whether keeping promoters out is going to depress the asset price. Can the market actually throw up the real price of an entity where promoter will be interested in jacking up prices just to retain control? Could that go for a penny? I mean, many questions and many arguments and counter arguments. Where are you in this entire debate? Does keeping promoters out of the process actually depress the asset value?
Well, it certainly would impact. There cannot be two opinions about it, and it would actually compromise in some way the overall objective of the law or every individual insolvency process, which is to maximize the return for the creditors, because that is what the creditors look out of it, as to maximize their returns. While of course I fully agree with Dr. Sahu that the enterprise value has to be retained so that the other stakeholders can also benefit from it, because the enterprise must continue as a part of the economy. But the both have to be balanced, and one objective can't really serve at the cost of the other. So it's all about balancing, and that's where Cyril's points are very, very relevant. But also, I mean, I think one of the other aspects of it is allow me to digress for a moment, is that you see, modern insolvency laws since the 1970s, when US for the first time introduced the concept of modern insolvency law to the world in the form of Chapter 11, are built on the fundamental premise that you have to recognize that when people do business, they succeed or fail, and people do default. And as a society, as a mature society, as a matured economy, we have to learn to forgive the unfortunate debtors, those who may have defaulted for reasons beyond their control, and not to penalize them, and also to give them a second chance. And that whole concept of the modern insolvency law, which was greatly applauded by when this insolvency law was passed, I think to some extent that has been clouded. And there will be obviously a cost to that, both in terms of the perception as we are discussing it right now, not just in the country but globally as well, because it raises eyebrows, because nowhere else in the world these kind of provisions exist with regard to ineligibility. But having said that, Indian dynamics are unique, and we can't really bracket them with any other part of the world as a matter of factly. But to answer your point, to answer your question, yes, definitely it would impact value, and therefore compromise the returns which the creditors expect out of the insolvency process for themselves.
Okay, Maitri, comment on that. Mr. Batra here says that it is going to impact the value and in turn impact the return for the creditor, which in many ways there are two stakeholders in this, the borrower and the one who's and the creditor, right? So therefore, if the creditor's interests are not going to be met, what is the objective? But I'm giving you the counter argument, which is an equally compelling one from the government, which says that the moment you bring the promoters in, they may artificially jack up prices, because they obviously want to retain the asset at all costs. It's a desperate move without necessarily having the ability to repay them. So they're worried. So we'd rather discover an economic value that may be lower than what the promoter is willing to bid, because that may not be the natural value of the asset. How would you respond to that, Maitri?
Sandeep, I'm very uncomfortable with terms like law and morality. I think you need to keep them quite distinct, though of course law is shaped, morality plays a very big view, but when you part in shaping law, but when you use terms like good promoters, bad promoters, deserving, undeserving, these are just very subjective words. The law has to be clearly defined. So where the promoter is guilty of some definite fraud after a forensic audit, definitely such promoters need to be kept out. But merely because a business decision has gone wrong, I think it would be very wrong, in fact, to deny him access to bidding. He should be allowed to bid. In fact, somebody might even challenge it as a violation of his right under the Constitution to do business. So I think it's very important that we do that, because, and if I agree with Cyril Shroff entirely, that you have to take a nuanced view. Let me just give you examples here of, say, public sector undertakings. The Insolvency Code does not say anything about exempting public sector undertakings. So take the case of Air India. Is it a non-performing asset? Most certainly. Who is the promoter? Government of India, all of us taxpayers. Is it a willful default? Does Government of India has tax revenue, so perhaps it could pay. So it's very difficult to draw these very lines, very sharp lines. If you can trust the banker to take a decision whether to lend or not, then why is it that when it comes to a decision of whether to nurse the unit or not, suddenly you have all these doubts about the committee of creditors? I think you have to accept that they have some knowledge, they have some wisdom, and yes, it is important to have timelines. It's important that we get the legal processes faster, and promoters who are unscrupulous are not given a second chance. But I think you cannot have this black and white. The real world is different shades of grey.
Okay, Sanjeev Sanyal, wanted to come in on that. What is your own assessment? What about price discovery? Many allege absence of a promoter is going to depress the value of assets. Maitri here believes this also denies him his fundamental right to do business. Where are you on those arguments? And is denying a promoter or keeping him out, and if we were to believe that this is going to suppress the value of an asset, doesn't that also distort the supply side of the market?
Well, obviously the creditors would want to get the best particular price. There's no doubt about it. And yes, there is a practice worldwide, by the way, where the original promoters do indeed bid for these assets, and that is one of the reasons the law had originally, after thinking about it, had allowed for it. But there were other concerns about moral hazard. So on balance, this is what has been decided. Now there are pros and cons to that argument, but given the circumstances that and the evolution of events, it was decided that this particular path be taken. Now it is possible that we will discover that it makes price discovery worse, that we will adjust that again. But as we go through it, this is our judgment that given the circumstances, given the many attempts that have already made on these assets to try and resolve them before coming to the auction stage, that this is perhaps the best option as things stand.
Mm-hmm. Cyril Shroff, come in on this whole price discovery debate. Do you think we're being too unfair to the market by saying that the price is going to be depressed because the promoters are not bidding? If you were to look at the expression of interest that have been submitted for a lot of these assets, there's been a considerable amount of interest for some of these assets. Are we being too presumptuous to say that the real economic value will not be realized just because the promoter has been kept out of the process?
So I have three observations here. So my first sort of thesis, so I think there are really two types of or two classes of cases. One where there are bidders and interested parties other than the promoter, and there could be one or there could be more. Some of the big insolvency cases I think fall within that variety, and there will be a whole genre of cases probably as you go down the insolvency sort of values, that where the promoter is probably the only fellow who is interested. So in the first category where there are other interested bidders, I think the competitive tension will enable price discovery, but perhaps the emotional value which the promoter would have paid, which would be higher, which could be a little higher than the economic value, you will lose out on that. But that is sort of one thing. Maybe you could live without that. As you go down into the second category, where the promoter is typically the only guy who is interested in this, and there are varieties and varieties of assets, you have left yourself with no choice but to liquidate. Now, and therefore the resolution process is essentially nothing but a step towards an early dissolution. So I think we need to ask ourselves the question as to whether that is what we really intended by this ordinance, or whether there should have been at least one more realistic option of a resolution other than a liquidation, because in liquidation it will be sold in very crude terms for scrap value. And is there or is there not a larger moral hazard in driving all these cases into very large number of cases into almost certain liquidation? So I'll leave that as a question, not as an answer, for us to ponder about whether that was something which we thought about. Yes, of course, there are a number of prominent recent cases where this ordinance was probably devised for a few cases which were very visible, where there was a bit of a political issue in terms of seeing the promoters come back. But you have to realize that this now ordinance applies to everybody. So there's a sort of a point to ponder there. And again, whether the emotional value or the emotional premium which the promoter would have paid, that will be lost, because any other bidder looking at it is going to look at it purely unemotionally, clinically and commercially only. So you may still get the commercial value based on some competitive tension, but you definitely lose the emotional premium.
Mr. Sahu, do you expect default rates to come down once promoters realize that you can't default and buy back an asset cheap? The whole psyche that has so far been?
I see this code will bring in a lot of behavioral changes. We have seen quite a few cases, as soon as an operational creditor serves a notice on a debtor that it will initiate a proceeding, quite often operational creditor comes up and repays the amount. They repay after application is filed in NCLT, they repay before the application is admitted. So to me, I see going forward, the behavior of both debtor and creditor would change, and probably the incidence of a default will be much less, and I may not be wrong to say that the best use of the code would be not using it at all. Just this code on the statute and the institutional framework in existence is a good deterrence for people to default.
It's an interesting point you're making. I'm sure Maithili would argue that, it's more of a moral argument, but we've got a lot of ground to cover, and there's a point that I think both Maithili and Cyril made a short while ago, which is on related parties and what the ordinance does on that specific point. Sanjeev Sanyal, I want to get your quick view and then go to Maithili and Cyril both on this particular point, because anyone distantly related, guarantors, those prohibited in securities are all barred. It's a sweeping sort of move on related parties, and there are serious concerns on that front. Many believe that will this not lead to a sort of stillborn law in many ways?
Well, we recognize that there may be risks of various kinds, but the fact of the matter is, what are we really attempting to do here? We are basically trying to make sure that when this, we are after all dealing with NPAs that are now been in the process for quite some time. So what we want to do is to avoid a adverse selection problem or a moral hazard problem, both of which would turn up if you had a situation where there was an incentive to simply take it to the very end and liquidate for every single asset. What we do want to do is to incentivize a wider variety of people to participate in it, which can, by the way, involve the previous promoter. These laws are really meant for dealing with willful defaulters, as you know, and also for those for a variety of reasons that the creditors and the NCLT process does not think were able to come up with a credible resolution plan by the time we ended up in this last auction stage. So this is not directed at promoters as a class at all, and certainly isn't the case that we are trying to do some sort of retribution for past sins. What ultimately is the economy needs is to get these assets liquid again and economically deployed again.
Cyril, I want you to come in on the point of related party and the sort of sweeping observations made in the ordinance as far as related parties are concerned. In your own sense, what kind of an impact is that likely to have?
So is that a question for me?
That's right.
Yeah, so the whole provision regarding connected persons, which has been defined in clause I, is essentially like an anti-avoidance provision, so that it really tries to put teeth to the proposition that what you can't do directly, you shall not do indirectly. That's the reason for this. So, if promoters A, B and C were disqualified in clauses A to H, what clause I does is that you promoters ABC shall not, through your connections with a set of people, P, Q and R, will not come back through the back door. So this is typical it's a typical legislative or regulatory tool that you effectively provide a framework that if you can't do something directly, you shall not do it indirectly as well. So I don't have an intellectual quarrel with this, because if there is something which you want to achieve in terms of prohibiting a certain class of people, it's fair to say that you will not allow them to do it indirectly as well. The only observation I would have over here is that in the enthusiasm to be comprehensive, that it may actually land up inadvertently hurting some genuine investors who may get, or parties who may be covered, who may have actually no direct economic connection in a voluntary sort of way, but there may be some involuntary connections which they may have either through relationships or through business connections which they may have, which are but they're completely separate economic entities they may get swept in by the rigor of the definition of connected persons. Now, I think on this one, whilst I see the logic for having it, I think the regulations which will be framed pursuant to this, I hope, will provide some discretion to interpret it, where there may be sort of economically unrelated entities with a level of involuntary connection which can be kind of explained away. But it will be, it will have to be done very carefully. It's sort of, it will be a bit like walking on eggshells to make sure that, that we come out with the right balance on this. But the fact that there is a provision for governing connected persons and related parties, I don't have an intellectual problem with that.
Okay, not an intellectual problem because it goes to the avoidance theory at all. But Mr. Batra, I wanted to come in on the resolution professionals. I mean, should it not be left to the resolution professionals alone? Can they not be trusted? Is it so because the system is too nascent? And you know, the counter argument is it's all very good to keep things under the resolution professional and under the committee of creditors. But guess what? They are not the ones who run these businesses. They are not subject matter or sector matter experts. And you know, which is why eyebrows are being raised. So there are arguments to be made on both sides, isn't it?
Which is fine because there are resolution professionals who are able, competent, have the skills, or can draw the skills from the subset of people which work in their organization, especially the bigger organizations. And there are those who are probably not as well equipped and they would learn over a period of time. But the larger issue is that you know, it is the responsibility of the government, the regulator, and all of us as stakeholders to build the institution of resolution professional as well as the committee of creditors, because they are fundamental to the whole insolvency process. They sit at the heart of the insolvency process. And as we've heard in the debate over the last more than half an hour, that the committee of creditors is something which we need to trust, rely on, and depend more on. And we do understand that as a body of creditors, they do have enough wisdom to be able to take decisions in their own interest and in the interest of the stakeholders that they're accountable to. And likewise, resolution professionals as well, you know, they come into this sphere of new discipline in order to sort of make use of the opportunities, but of course at the same point in time guard their reputation and perform well. And as we've seen, the law actually provided a great amount of trust in them in terms of the legal provisions as to the responsibilities that they have to perform. But we've seen over a period of time, over the last 1 year, as to how there have been regulations or others where more and more kind of checks and balances have been imposed on their duties. But this ordinance actually takes away a lot from them in terms of their ability to be able to perform. So for example, in the previous version of the law, it was entirely the responsibility of the resolution professional to decide the process for bidding. But now, of course, it has been said, while the resolution professional will decide the process of the bidding, but he has to take COC approval. And not only that, now the regulator can also prescribe the procedure. So it takes away, in a way, the freedom and the flexibility that is required in each individual case in terms of the process that you may need to follow, which need not be prescriptive. So there are these pitfalls and cracks which unfortunately will cause the problem of the efficiency of the process, the speed of the process slipping through them.
Okay, Mr. Sahu, I want you to answer a question that a lot of people are losing sleep over, that could this lead to a lot of litigation? Do you believe promoters have any ground to challenge this ordinance, citing retrospectiveness?
Two things. One is probably they would get a better advice from advocate for the grounds for challenge. But nothing wrong in somebody challenging and seeking a guidance from court. Court, government, we are not adversaries of each other. All of us are pursuing a common objective. And if we have gone wrong, nothing wrong in court correcting us. So I don't see any problem on that count at all.
Cyril, come in on that. You're probably the expert on that front. Mr. Sahu obviously saying he doesn't see a problem with corporates moving court. Do you see a lot of litigation coming through? And more importantly, specifically, what are the grounds in the ordinance that you think corporates could potentially challenge in court? Cyril Shroff?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that question properly. Could you repeat that?
Sure. I was asking, do you expect a lot of promoters to now move court? And specifically, what are the grounds in the ordinance that you think promoters could potentially challenge in court? Is it the retrospectiveness or anything else? What are the specific grounds that could potentially be challenged in court?
So I'm not going to be answering that because I may pretty much land up defending the ordinance. So I'm not going to start giving grounds for the other side. So I'm going to duck that question. But do I expect? Litigation? I think so, and that's the sound that that we're hearing from the marketplace as well. Is that since there are people who are quite unhappy with this, somebody's going to have a go at it. That's not to be expected. But the more relevant question is, do you think that this challenge, or does one think that this challenge will be sustained? I think given the mood in this country, including the current judicial mood in the Supreme Court as well, I think it has a very low chance of succeeding. But there will be.
Yeah, that's true. That's exactly what the government is also banking upon. I think that's exactly what the government is also banking upon, that how can the courts find favor with someone who's defaulted. But Sanjeev Sanyal, you know, I'm going to ask you the bigger political question. If UPA 2 was all about policy paralysis, will trust deficit best describe the government and the industry's current relationship?
No, I mean, you know, we have a good relationship with with the business class. You know, many of these things that you are witnessing is a part and parcel of a healthy market-based economy where, you know, the whole point about risk-taking and uncertainty and innovation is that along the way, businesses go bust. You know, that's how creative destruction happens. You cannot have entry without an exit. And all that we are doing is creating an exit for Indian industry so that we do not keep accumulating these you know, bad investments of the past, but on an ongoing basis keep liquidating them. That is absolutely a critical part of the creative destruction of a market economy and an innovative economy. We should embrace it, and frankly there is no need to be emotional at all about the whole thing. This is a part and parcel of the churn, and we should do it as soon and as clinically and as cleanly as possible and go to the next round of investment.
Indeed, Maithili, I know you wanted to make a point on what Cyril said, and so make that, but I'm adding a question to that, which is, you know, the irony of it all. I mean, a few years back, this was called a Soot Boot Ki Sarkar, a right of center government seen as, you know, pro-market, pro-business, and its industry that's now sort of up in arms. Do you think it's sort of been driven by political consideration as well? You know, a point that Cyril made at the start of this debate as well, that the government has to be seen as clamping down on, you know, fat cat entrepreneurs who've sort of, you know, driven their business to bankruptcy and sort of now want to now are seeking a lifeline. So is it driven by that primarily?
Well, I wouldn't say primarily, but certainly, just like demonetization was driven by political considerations. Here too, I think political considerations are coming to the forefront, particularly with the elections coming up. And to respond to Cyril's point that he sees that there will be challenges to this ordinance, but he expects that the current mood in the Supreme Court, it will not stand. And this is what is rather distressing, because just recently we heard the Supreme Court tell, in the case of JP, they gave a ruling that the directors should not even alienate their personal properties. Now, this is ridiculous. With the entire idea of a separate corporate entity, limited liability companies, the whole idea of a limited liability company is that your liability is limited to the extent of your shareholding, and the corporate veil is lifted only where there are cases of fraud. So how can you tell the directors that their personal properties cannot be alienated? So I think the Supreme Court is also going overboard, like the government, in this desire to be seen as one with the common people. I think law is not about sentiment. Law should be about interpreting the law, and laws should be correctly drafted. Otherwise, we really run the risk of going to the other extreme, and far from being Soot Boot Sarkar, we could really fall between the stools.
All right, we hope nothing falls between the stools. But on that note, completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate, Maithili Bhusnurmat, Cyril Shroff, Sanjeev Sanyal, Mr. M.S. Sahu and Mr. Batra, thank you very, very much for being with us.
Now, many believe this is a blunt move driven by political considerations, but the truth is that for India to develop, promoters need to have the fear of God. Bank money is borrowed cash and mismanagement needs to be punished, even if that means the promoter has to let go of an asset.
I think the promoter class at this time realizes that the rules of the contract have changed and debt isn't equity anymore. For India to develop, we need all that money to be invested in more fruitful, more fertile investments. Thank you very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate. Up next is Top 10 at 10.
Good night.